Dear friends, I bet you're wondering, the church believes in vampires? No. Any more than the church believes in zombies. But in a sense, we do have a theology of vampires, just as we have a theology of zombies, in a manner of speaking. And if you haven't seen that video from ypriest.com, I encourage you to watch that after watching this short video. In a sense, we have a theology of vampires, meaning that there is a theological framework for the classic understanding of vampires in horror literature. For example, Bram Stoker, even though he was not a Catholic, used Catholic sensibilities and theology in writing his book Dracula. Now, this is very different than the more recent phenomena of Twilight, which has a Mormon theology underneath it. Here we're looking at the classic Catholic theology of Dracula and other similar forms of literature and movies. Very specifically, you can see vampires, for example in Dracula, as, you might say, the inversion of who God is and what God is all about. That rejecting God in sin brings not everlasting life in a form that we would find suitable, but a kind of everlasting horror. Dracula may live forever on earth, but who wants that? It's different than the everlasting life God wishes to give us in heaven. For that end, God became human, suffered and died on the cross, giving his body and blood on the cross, and then Jesus feeds us with his body and blood in the Eucharist. Opposite to that, you can see Dracula, who in rejecting God gains an everlasting life of horror, you might say, and then doesn't give his blood for life. He sucks the blood of others, taking their lives. You can see the opposites between how Christ is the risen sun, the light that shines in the darkness, whereas vampires in classic literature cannot go in the daylight because they live in darkness. You can see how things such as holy water are used to grant new life in baptism, whereas that is, you might say, death to vampires. You can see how, for example, Van Helsing, who in the book Dracula was an agent of the Holy See, working with special permission of the Pope, was able to use the Blessed Sacrament, the body and blood of Christ, to hallow ground so that Dracula could not live there. Because in the end, Dracula, in a sense, represents the rejection of everything of who God is in Jesus Christ and what he stands for. Now, what does this have to do with us today? In this sense, we do have a theology of vampires at work that does apply to us today. There may not be real vampires, but our world, in a sense, practices different forms of vampirism. If Dracula would suck the life out of people, we live now in a culture of death, where we destroy innocent human life at its very beginning in the womb through things like abortion, where we now have euthanasia, where we take the lives of the elderly and the sick. We have a culture of death, where we use people. We do embryonic stem cell research. We, in a sense, think that other weaker forms of life can be destroyed to try and preserve our own. If that's not vampirism, what is? You might say that this theology of vampirism reminds us that in the end, Christ gave his life. God became human and gave his blood for our salvation. And therefore, we are always called to love, to protect innocent human life, to give our lives in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. We are called to, you might say, protect life and live in the light, whereas vampires take life and live in the darkness. Dear friends, may you always live in the light, and may you remember that Christ gives life, and Dracula takes it. May you be on the side of Jesus Christ.